Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with my library tour, my 2019 iteration of my library tour, and we are firmly mired in the history section. So if you don't like history, first of all, what's wrong with you? And second, you're not going to enjoy this haul except for my occasional anecdotes. We are doing this entire wall, this entire east wall is all history, and I wish there were more of it. I wish that the book collection in this room is largely miscellaneous. There are two main themed collections, biography and history, and I wish that both biography and history were much bigger. But this will certainly do. It'll do for a start. And throughout most of this library tour, there has been precious little in the way of organization. I don't really organize my books. I've been taking some ribbing about it in the course of this library tour. But this is one tiny place where there is a bit of organization, although the organization-minded among you are going to say there still isn't enough, even in this section. But we're going to do what we can, and the reason why is because these are books about World War II, which I consider to be the greatest story in the history of stories. It wasn't until humans came along that there were stories, actual meta things called stories. Before that, stuff happened, and now everywhere else in the universe, stuff happens, but not stories, not human-drawn narratives, and this is not only one of them, but an epic one, where the nations of the modern world went to war with each other. And not just sent delegations to some jungle in Southeast Asia, but fought with their own armies, on their own soil, in massive numbers, on a massive scale, showing in the course of that conflict every gradation of human pathos, human heroism, human villainy that you could find in Homer. This is an actual war that actually happened, that outstrips the war with Troy on every level. So I can't get enough of it. I can't read enough of it. I read everything that crosses my plate about World War II, and have often sought out recondite volumes that didn't cross my plate. So, and it looks like this whole shelf, probably the next one too, are all World War II books. Starting with this monster of a thing. This is Telford Taylor's book, Munich, The Price of Peace. Gigantic thing by our cheerful author, who represented the United States at the Nuremberg trial. And this is his account of what is typically sort of shallowly considered the thing that started it all, which was the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flying back and forth to Germany at the beck and call of a mad dictator in order to avoid war. That's why you have a rifle, but you also have an umbrella. And Neville Chamberlain famously carried his umbrella with him when he flew to Germany. And Taylor's book on it is incredible. I would have called it the final word on the subject, except one of the things I love about history is that you can't ever have such a thing. Even if the documents are static, even if there are no additions to the documents, you're still going to have somebody who comes along with a new idea. And they might be convincing. Using the exact same documents, they might make you see things in a different light. I love that. There's a new book, The Bell of Treason, that is just about to come out in hardcover, might be out already in hardcover. And in that book, the author asserts that not only are the interpretations fluid, but that the facts are wrong. That the facts of Munich are wrong. That people have been reading only the sources that serve their narrative. And that really there was no military reason to capitulate to any of Hitler's demands. That's pretty fascinating. that's going to get people arguing, and that's great. I love that. The story in Taylor's book, which came out 60 years ago, is the standard one, which is that Czechoslovakia was supine, it was helpless before Germany, and needed its allies to protect it, and its allies did not do that. Instead, sacrificed Czechoslovakia to Hitler's ambition, to his acquisitiveness, to avoid another world war, which loomed large in the attitudes of every single person alive at the time, especially statesmen who had been through the First World War. They wanted nothing more than to avoid that phenomenon happening again. They had no idea, no one had any idea, that something much worse was immediately in the offing. People could sense that there was trouble. Some people were clueless. Some people were clueless as to what Nazi Germany was. Probably the most name recognition person example of that would be Sigmund Freud, who if you read his diaries, you barely hear Nazi Germany mentioned. He was right in the heart of it. He was in Vienna and would certainly have been sent to a camp and killed if he hadn't left. He left just in time. His sisters stayed and all died in concentration camps. He would certainly have died. Sigmund Freud, dead in a concentration camp. And if you read he was making a journal entry every day. And if you read them, you'd scarcely be able to tell that anything like that was happening. Even right to the end, his rationale, at least the one that he confessed to himself, his rationale for wanting to leave was to seek medical treatment for the cancer that was killing him. So you had people who didn't recognize what was going on, who didn't recognize that there was no negotiating with a monster and a liar and a psychopath, and instead thought any amount of negotiation is worthwhile to avoid the bloodbath of the Somme. That was the mind frame. That was Neville Chamberlain's mind frame, and it would be a hammer blow to his reputation if it turned out that wasn't true. But none of that was true. But we have Telford Taylor again for the next book. This is his book on the Nuremberg Trials, the anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials, in which the victors put their defeated enemies on trial and invited the whole world to watch. And it's a fascinating subject for me, especially since it's happening at the same time and hard and right before the infamous kangaroo court trials in Russia. And you've got plenty of people at the time and since wondering what is the difference. You're not going to allow any of these people to walk free. You wouldn't put them on trial if you weren't going to punish them. It raises all sorts of questions about what we use trials for and what is the true nature of justice. I just love it. And Telford Taylor writes better about this than he does about Munich, of course, because he's involved. Then the next one is just another book on Munich, or on Nuremberg, rather. This is Justice at Nuremberg. Fantastic book, much better written than Telford Taylor's, about the same thing, about the ins and outs, the daily records, who did what, who said what, all that sort of stuff, all the stuff that was so incredibly effectively dramatized, although it was also Hollywooded in Judgment at Nuremberg. A fantastic movie. I urge you all to see it. If you haven't seen Judgment at Nuremberg, I urge you all to see it. Not only will you see, right from the opening frame, a truly fantastic acting performance on the part of Maximilian Schell, but not only will you see an old and ailing Spencer Tracy at his most ruminative. He knew perfectly well how to do the Hollywood things that Hollywood asked him to do. You could look at him and tell what kind of role he'd be cast for. But in Judgment at Nuremberg, he tries a slightly more inward approach to his role, and it works really well. It was a gamble that pays off really well. Part of it was due to the fact that he really didn't have the energy to do more than that, and also at Judgment at Nuremberg. Not that you may or not be interested, but in Judgment at Nuremberg, you will see that an actor named William Shatner can, in fact, act. Those of us who've watched Star Trek forever have vainly been protesting that for years. But nevertheless, you take him out of Star Trek, and maybe you'll see it a little clearer. It's a terrific movie. Terrific. So I think that's it for Nuremberg. I believe that's it. And that may be it for Order. Oh my God, wouldn't that be terrible? Okay, here we have Gordon Prang's book, At Dawn We Slept. This is his big book on Pearl Harbor. And once upon a time, I had 7 or 8 books on Pearl Harbor. I don't know why I don't anymore. I don't see any others, which is really bad, because Pearl Harbor is, of course, completely pivotal to World War II, and also the source of lots of disagreement. You get disagreement in the conspiracy theory crowd, who say that Franklin Roosevelt knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor and let it happen in order to goad the country into war. And regardless of what you think about those conspiracy theories, it is true, nevertheless, just objectively true, that the steps that Franklin Roosevelt took prior to Pearl Harbor towards the Japanese, cutting off their fuel, guaranteed some kind of response. Now, he was taking a 50-50 gamble that response would be diplomatic, that he would drive them to the negotiating table. He was not a young man when he made that decision. He had to know that it was a gamble, and that the Japanese national character, especially the military caste, could easily have made it what it turned out to be, which was all-out war for survival. Fascinating subject. And also, of course, At Dawn We Slept and most other Pearl Harbor books also want to assess blame. They not just, did Roosevelt know that the Japanese fleet was coming, but who was to blame for how bad it was on the ground when it finally happened. Random chance didn't make it a knockout blow. It could easily have been a knockout blow. If aircraft carriers had been present at Pearl Harbor and destroyed, the United States would have been not only completely defanged in the Pacific theater, but vulnerable to invasion in California, all along the western coast. The United States would have effectively no navy in that part of the world if that had happened. It didn't, but it easily could have. And also the things that in hindsight look just terrible, all the battleships being grouped together, when in hindsight, knowing now what no one at the time thought, which is what if they were subject to an air bombardment. Well, if they're subject to an air bombardment and they're all grouped together like that on Battleship Row, you're going to be hard-pressed to miss them. And that maybe that's not a good arrangement. A lot of that is hindsight. But it makes Pearl Harbor just fascinating to read, especially when you know how much hinged on it. Okay, all right. This next one is one of many things like it that I have. I have a weakness for what could easily be argued to be the least useful type of book on World War II, which is the huge one-volume narrative history. There's easily an argument to be made that the best World War II library would contain none such things. It would all be specific studies, Nuremberg, Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, that sort of thing, but nothing like this. This is Robert Leckie's book, Delivered from Evil, a great big history of World War II from start to finish, in which, by necessity, nothing is going to get more than a page or two. So you start to wonder, well, what does that mean then? What good does that do? I have often argued the opposite tack, that these actually do quite a bit of good, because it is a narrative. It is, in addition to other things, it is a narrative, it is a story. And it matters that we tell that story from start to finish, especially if we do it well. Leckie he is a fantastic military historian. He's really good on the rest of it too, but when you get him giving 2 pages to a battle in the Atlantic or in the Alps or whatever, he's absolutely without peer. So I'd like to think that I probably pruned down the number of one-volume histories of World War II that I've had, but I definitely kept this one. And also, I might, while I'm at it, recommend Leckie's books on the Wars of America. This, I think, might be one of them. Or maybe he did this for a separate commission. But he also did a couple of big books on the wars of America from the very beginning, from colonial times, all the way to Vietnam. And they make amazing reading. If you ever see one of those old trade paperbacks, if you just pay attention to the name Leckie and get it, if you see it, because Robert Leckie's a terrific writer. Okay. All right, this next one we've seen already on this channel. We saw the trade paperback. This is the hardcover of Snow and Steel by Peter Caddick Adams. Another great big book. This is on the Battle of the Bulge, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, where the fate of Germany, the military fate of Germany, was completely known. It was ringed on all sides. There were aggressive armies pressing it everywhere. It had run out of fuel. It had run out of men. Old men and boys were manning a lot of its key positions. It had run out of money. It had run out of international respectability. It had run out of allies, and had stripped away the layer of protective fat between its military survival and the absolute anti-Semitic lunacy of Adolf Hitler, who saw the end was coming and doubled and tripled his efforts to destroy every Jew within range of even any kind of power that he had. Which is, I know this is kind of silly to say, but that's insane behavior. Even if you discount the anti-Semitism, that's still insane behavior as a national leader. Even as someone who doesn't want to be shot by the Russians, even as not a national leader. Anyway, ringed in as he was, Hitler sensed in the way that he had an ability that he definitely had on the battlefield. He shared it with, for instance, Robert E. Lee, of being able to sense sort of the psychology, the zeitgeist of his opponents at any given time, sometimes with uncanny accuracy. And he sensed that the Allies knew that the end was near as well as he did, and were relaxed on their front, with Germany, all along their front with Germany, that they might have been relaxed. And that if he waited for crippling winter weather and had hardened troops, he might be able to push through their lines to get to the nearest big navigable river or to get to the sea. That was insane. That was never going to happen. That was never going to happen. Surprise! He was enamored of it because his blitzkrieg troops had done so well with the element of surprise. But it only works against militarily unprepared people. It doesn't work against armies in the field. Not for long. It can work in the short term, and the Battle of the Bulge did, hence the name. The line bulged. The Germans were actually able to push the line a bit. And it caused a lot of panic and a lot of great decisions and bad decisions, and it flushed out a huge number of books on that subject. That's anybody who had anything to do with the Bulge wrote a book. And it was crushed, of course. There was never any doubt of that. There was never any doubt whatsoever of that. Nevertheless, even though it was a foregone conclusion, Caddick Adams makes great reading out of it. This guy is so good at writing World War II history. He is so good. He has another book, too, Sand and Steel, which now I can't remember if we've seen it already. If we haven't, then we will, because it'll come up. Okay, all right, this next one is also about the Battle of the Bulge. It's a much earlier vintage. It's 50 years before Caddick Adams. This is Charlie MacDonald, and this is his A Time for Trumpets. A lot of you will have seen this in... there was a trade paperback that had this style, 70s and early 80s style cover illustration, and it sold like crazy. The hardcover did well, but the trade paperback sold like crazy. And there's a reason why, because MacDonald is a terrific storyteller. He gets as much of the detail in as he possibly can, but he also is a terrific storyteller. This is kind of funny. This is The Passage of Time. That is our author. Those are both our author. And this is just, forever and ever, this was the definitive popular account of the Battle of the Bulge. I'm not sure that Peter Caddick Adams has dethroned it. I like to think of it as just the two of them together. When I finished Snow and Steel and was so impressed, I immediately went back to A Time for Trumpets and reread it, I reread it with my heart in my throat, because I was thinking, okay, you just read a fantastic modern account of this same thing. Surely now when you read one that's 60 years old, you're going to see its flaws. You're going to see warts that you didn't see before. And that didn't happen. I think they make perfect compliments to each other. Let's see what this next one is. Okay, this is Danny Parker. Oh my. All right, well, this is another Battle of the Bulge book. This is Fatal Crossroads, which is about the Malmedy Massacre, which was one tiny event in the Battle of the Bulge. One German company that had always been known. They had a long reputation of being psychotic, homicidal maniacs, not just soldiers shooting their enemies on the commands of their superiors, but just killers, just a band of killers, people who liked to kill. And this was a case. You can see, if you look closely, you can see that those frozen, charred corpses in the field have evidence numbers on them, because there was a huge inquiry about a German company that just mowed down helpless American prisoners in a field. And it was called the Malmedy Massacre, and it has generated a number of books on its own. I think this is the only one that I have, but it makes for grim reading, fascinating reading. Okay, this is a book that you've seen on my channel many times. You've seen it on Mark Richardson's channel many times. We're not going to shut up about this guy until you all read him, because he really is that good. This is Samuel Eliot Morison. This is The Two Ocean War. He did a multi-volume, dozen volumes or more, of an official history of the United States Navy during World War II. Commissioned to do so by the Navy, by the brass at the Navy, who knew that something historic was happening and that they should have a historian on board when it was. And those books, I know you're not going to believe me. I don't have them myself, but don't let that work against me. Those books are great. Every single one of them. They read great. The only thing that I can compare them to, in terms of just a nonstop thrilling reading experience, is Patrick O'Brian. Is the Aubrey and Maturin novels. The two are roughly the same length. They sit roughly the same size on a shelf. And they are equally absorbing. Believe it or not, they are. Not only in sequence, but if you pull out one of the volumes at random, you'll also be pulled in. Morrison was an old school Boston historian from a time in his youth he remembered the great Boston historians of the previous generation, where if you had told one of those people, you know, as a historian, all you really need to do is amass the facts and then put them in a book, they would all have disdained you completely. They knew perfectly well that half the task of a historian is to tell a story. And Morrison remembered that. He absorbed it in his DNA. So he never wrote anything that didn't have that element. And the Two Ocean War is his abridgment, his one-volume abridgment of that massive set. People, when that set was coming out, people were collecting it. They were professing to read it. But the Two Ocean War did really well, because it was a book that people could actually grapple with. I can't recommend it highly enough. And if you're at a yard sale, flea market of any kind, and you see that multi-volume Samuel Eliot Morrison set on the operations of the Navy in World War II, and you're the least bit interested, buy it. Read it, try it, especially if you can get it, you know, all the times in yard sales or whatever. If you put all those things in a box and make an offer to somebody, $5, they'll take it, because they can't get rid of them. That's the only reason they can't get rid of them, is because of how long it is, not because of how boring it is. It is not boring. And Mark and I are just going to keep telling you that until you try a Samuel Eliot Morrison volume. So what is this next? Oh, okay. All right. This is Max Hastings. He's one of 3 or 4 great World War II historians working today, and this is his big book on the war, Inferno. Everybody, sooner or later, every major historian is tempted, or is tempted by their agent, to do a book like this. This is Max Hastings' book. It is very much what he does. It's very much what he does. He has a certain way of writing history. It's very good. It's very gripping. It's very battalion style up. He knows all the names. He reads all the diaries and letters, so that he can personalize the experience of people dying face down in 8 feet thick of mud, or freezing to death on the plains of the Ural or whatever. And he does that really better than anybody. And this is just one huge book of him doing that. Okay, all right. This next one is a classic. I would say one of the only genuine literary classics to come out of World War II history. I would get flack about that, but I stand by my guns. This is William Shirer, and this is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. His enormous book that sold like gangbusters, set him and his descendants up forever with the sale of this thing. It's massive. It's 1,200 pages long, and he knew a lot of this stuff because he was there to see it happen. And this book is absolutely lambent with hatred. The idea that history has to be written dispassionately without any emotions in the game, he discards that right away and never looks back. And I myself am glad of that. I've often thought that as long as you're not contradicting the facts, acting like you don't have a dog in the game can often make your book boring. And if you do have a dog in the game and you act like you don't, well, then what is the point? Instead, there is no... Shirer here in this book is not waiting for you to come to the conclusion that the Nazis were a bloodthirsty gang of murderers. He's perfectly aware of that as a fact before he starts his book. He doesn't need to draw the facts together and wait for you to come to a conclusion. He just writes this book out of pure, icy hatred of the bad guys in this conflict. And I love it. I just absolutely love it. It is so dramatic, so just gripping as a reading experience. I couldn't do without it. And it also doubles as a giant soup to nuts history of the war in the West and a large part of the war in the East. It doesn't do anything or much of anything for the Pacific theater. But oftentimes that is true. Oftentimes if you're writing a series of books or one book on Hitler or on Nazi Germany or on the American army, and you get to a certain point in your series, oftentimes the next volume you write will simply be a history of the war in the West. No way to avoid it. There's no way to split the two. The same thing happened here. This is Richard Evans, who did a trilogy on the Nazis, the rise of the Nazis, and then the Nazis running Germany, and then the Nazis at war. And the Third Reich at war is essentially a military history of the war in the West, of World War II in the West. And as such, I think is the best volume in the series. I don't think I actually at the moment have any of the others. Which is kind of weird. I have had this trilogy many times. I had the UK trilogy in paperback. Once upon a time, I had the American paperbacks. I had the hardcovers. I think this might be the only volume in that trilogy that I currently have. If that's true, I have to fix that, because the other volumes are very much worth reading. Okay, this is a UK trade paperback of Antony Beevor, who's another one of those working great historians. This is his book on the fall of Berlin. Everybody does a book on that. All of the major World War II historians do a book on the fall of Berlin, on the slow, gradual destruction of this great jewel of a city, and the beggarment of its people, scrounging for dead rats in the street, carving slabs out of frozen horse carcasses on the streets that only a few years before they were promenading down in their Sunday best, listening to Schubert. and now all of a sudden it's 40-foot tall piles of rubble and unburied corpses of people that they knew as neighbors on the street. People always do one volume on the fall of Berlin because it is sort of an object lesson in the wages of war. I can only take so much. I don't think I have any of the other books like The End or anything like that. I think I just have that on the fall of Berlin. I think it was all I could take. Okay. Oh, this is fairly new. These are the war journals of Ernst Junger, who was a conscientious German. He was a conscientious German, and he was in occupied Paris, and he also went on to write many novels. He is in Penguin Classics. He's not an inconsiderable novelist at all. But these journals, I mean, I went into them with a little bit of trepidation. I'd only read bits of them before, and then I sat down with this book. This was last year. No, this was January. This is January of this year. Boy, that's rare. I ordinarily don't put 2019 books anywhere, and I keep them in one separate bookcase until I repatriate them elsewhere. This one just went straight into the section. Interesting. This blows away his fiction. Just blows it away in terms of he was such a good diarist. It's such a great thing for who is this? Columbia, the University of Columbia Press. It was such a good idea for them to bring out a book like that. Okay. Yeah, this has been a bit of an omission so far in this World War II. We have a lot more World War II books to look at, but you may have noticed nothing on the Holocaust. And this comes close to that. I once had a whole shelf of books on the Holocaust, and I would consult them sometimes every time a new one came out, and then there comes a time when you just have to back away a little from such a thing because it is such a relentlessly grim subject. So I go through periodic fluctuations where I will say, okay, you don't need 10 books on the Holocaust. What you need is one book that you really trust on the Holocaust. That's not a good idea. There are great works of history just happen, and you're supposed to have them. If you love history, you should have them and consult them. There isn't a preset number, and if you're feeling downbeaten and depressed and wormed out by the depressing nature of the subject, well, then toughen up a little. Don't get rid of the books. So I really need to do that. The point I'm trying to make is that I don't think this whole bookcase, this is 3 shelves and a top shelf, I don't think this whole bookcase is World War II, and it should be. I should have all of those Holocaust books. I should have all of Richard Evans. I should have all of those books on the fall of Berlin. I should have all of these things, and I will. One of the things I've been saying over and over again about this history section here is that I want more shelves on this wall. I want at least 2 more shelves on this wall to make this eye level so that I can just have more room. But this is Nicholas Waxman, and this is KL, A History of the Concentration Camps. I believe the publicity material on this book said that this was the first dedicated history of the concentration camps. Not the Holocaust, but the history of how concentration camps were built, how they worked, how they were financed, how they were commanded, how they operated from day to day. As you can guess, relentlessly grim reading, but really good. Okay, all right, here's another. Boy, I think this is also 2019. Is this also 2019? No, this is September 2018. This is Antony Beevor. Do we see? Yeah, we saw him for Berlin. This is the Battle of Arnhem, Operation Market Garden, that I really liked. I really like his style of writing. There are a couple of very minute points, of procedure and source reading in this book that I disagreed with, including one that I think is a major disagreement, a major thing where I think, okay, I think you read these sources and you read them wrong. I think it's just a mistake. And I was faced with the dilemma of what to do about that in my review. I reviewed this book, and I had 800 words. And even with the best concision imaginable. I'm pretty good at trash compacting the stuff that I need the reader to know before I can start making points about it. And I realized early on in that review, in thinking about that review, that I would need all 800 words simply to deal with that one piece of trivia. In order to call him on it, I would need first to tell the reader about it, and then tell them why it's wrong, and then tell him what he says, and then tell them why he says that and why it's wrong. And I eventually had to just dismiss it all from the review. I had to just dismiss it all because I didn't have 2,100 words. I had 800 words. I think I made some passing line in the review about how some of his readings of primary sources are up for intense debate, something like that. Didn't tell the reader anything about what they were. The reason that I made that call was because I decided in the end that those doctrinal points of disagreement don't detract from the overall wonderfulness of the book, that I can recommend the book anyway, even though there are a couple of places where I think Beevor and I disagree on the reading of primary sources. Yeah, okay, the same thing with this one. We've seen this already. This is Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladek. This is Indianapolis. Another small-scale subject about the ship that delivered the bomb. And then this is made famous in Jaws. Quint's monologue in Jaws makes this whole mission famous. And I had 800 words for this thing. It was a tiny amount of space, and had to get it all in. Not just the importance of the mission, but these authors go on about the later attempts to vindicate the name of the captain, and to reverse some of the Navy's injustices about meting out posthumous punishment for what went on with the Indianapolis. It wasn't, their contention is that it wasn't the captain's fault that his ship was sunk by the Japanese, and that it wasn't the captain's fault that his mission was so classified that their distress was not immediately known, that none of that was the captain's fault. And then you have to absolve the captain of that sort of thing. One way or another, it was another thing where I had a tough time working the whole thing into one review. Okay, and now we're at the end. This is the last one. It's not coming willingly. Okay, all right. This is David Cesarini. This is the final solution. This is a soup to nuts history of the Holocaust. One of, I think, a couple that I have. One of the ones that I kept, but I should have kept them all. This is, I think, fairly recent. Last year? Oh no, 2016. But unless I'm mistaken, this is the most recent. Just big, fat volume on the final solution on the Holocaust. And I kept it, I think, because of that, because it was the most recent one. But I need to get them all. I need to get all the ones back again. Fortunately, that's not hard to do. World War II histories are the easiest ones to recoup. They show up all the time because they're printed more. But anyway, that's it. That is the first shelf of World War II. I believe that at least a large chunk of the next shelf to come is also World War II. So we'll just go back to that. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. This went very long, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.